They say abandoned asylums hold echoes of the past, but what happens when those echoes become voices? For a group of ghost hunters, entering Blackwood Asylum became a horrifying reality they could never escape. My name is Erica, and this happened last year. I run a small paranormal investigation channel on YouTube. Most of the time, our team explores abandoned buildings, capturing creaks and shadows for entertainment. But when we decided to investigate Blackwood Asylum, we thought it would be just another video. We couldn't have been more wrong. The asylum had been abandoned for decades after a fire supposedly killed all the patients and staff. Locals claimed they still heard screams at night and saw lights flickering in the windows. We thought it was just folklore until we stepped inside. We arrived at the asylum just after sunset, our flashlights cutting through the thick mist that surrounded the crumbling building. The front doors were chained shut, but we found a broken window and climbed inside. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of smoke and decay. As we set up our equipment, I noticed something strange. The hallways seemed darker than they should have been, as if the shadows were alive. An hour into our investigation, we heard it. Faint footsteps echoing down the hall. "Is someone there?" I called. But the only response was silence. We followed the sound to an old patient ward, where the doors hung off their hinges and the paint peeled from the walls. Inside, we found a single wheelchair sitting in the middle of the room, its wheels rusted and covered in dust. The moment we stepped closer, it moved, rolling a few inches on its own. As we continued exploring, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, like distant voices, but soon they grew louder, overlapping us and echoing through the halls. "It's just the wind," my friend Ryan said, though his face was pale. But we all knew it wasn't. In one of the treatment rooms, we found strange symbols etched into the walls, along with words written in what looked like dried blood. "Leave before they wake." The temperature dropped suddenly, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "We shouldn't be here," our cameraman Jake muttered, his voice trembling. As we turned to leave, I saw her, a woman in a hospital gown standing at the end of the hallway. Her hair was matted, and her face was obscured by shadows, but her hollow eyes glowed faintly. "Who are you?" I called, but she didn't respond. Instead, she pointed toward the stairwell and vanished. Against our better judgment, we decided to follow her. The stairs creaked under our weight, and the air grew colder with every step. The basement was pitch black, the only light coming from our flashlights. In the corner, we found an old electroshock therapy machine, its wires tangled and rusted. The whispers grew louder, and we heard faint sobbing coming from the shadows. At the end of the basement was a heavy metal door, its surface scratched and dented. Scrawled across it were the words, "Do not open." "Maybe we should turn back," Jake said, his voice shaking. But before we could decide, the door creaked open on its own. Inside the room, we saw them, shadowy figures standing in a circle, their forms flickering like static. At the center of the circle was a rusted hospital bed, its mattress stained and torn. One of the figures turned toward us, its hollow eyes glowing. "You shouldn't be here," it said, its voice low and distorted. The others began to move, their movements jerky and unnatural, as they closed in on us. Panicking, we ran back up the stairs, but the hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, looping back to the same spots. The shadows followed us, their whispers overlapping into a deafening roar. Ryan tripped and fell, screaming as the shadows enveloped him. "Help me," he cried, but there was nothing we could do. Jake and I finally made it back to the main entrance, but the broken window we'd climbed through was gone, replaced by solid brick. The shadows filled the room, their forms twisting and shifting as they closed in. Desperate, I grabbed a wooden plank and swung it at the nearest figure, but it passed through like smoke. "You belong to us now," they whispered. I don't remember how we escaped. One moment, we were surrounded by shadows, and the next, we were standing in the parking lot, gasping for air. Ryan was gone, and when we tried to rewatch the footage, all we saw was static. The asylum has been sealed off since that night, and I haven't returned. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I still hear the whispers, and I wonder if Ryan is still trapped inside, or if the shadows are waiting for me to come back. If you ever hear about an abandoned asylum, stay away. Some places hold more than memories, and some echoes are meant to remain unanswered. They say train stations are places of movement and connection. But what happens when your journey never begins? For one traveler, stepping into Blackmore Station meant being trapped in a place where time stood still. My name is Amanda, and this happened last winter. I was traveling home for the holidays, and my train was delayed due to a snowstorm. Blackmore Station wasn't on the map. I only found it when my GPS suggested it as a shortcut to the main line. It was late, nearly midnight, and the place was deserted. The sign above the platform was rusted, barely legible, and the only light came from a flickering bulb hanging above the station entrance. I thought I'd wait for the next train, but it never came. Inside the station, everything felt wrong. The air was thick, and the walls were covered in old posters advertising events and destinations I'd never heard of. Places like Eternal Rest Junction and Nowhere Line. The clock on the wall was frozen at 11:58, and every now and then I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but no one was there. Probably just my nerves, I told myself. But as I sat on the bench, I noticed something strange. The posters on the wall seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. One moment, they were blank. The next, they displayed eerie messages like, "Your train has already departed," or "Stay until called." I decided to wait on the platform, hoping to see some sign of life. The tracks stretched into the darkness, disappearing in both directions. As the minutes passed, the sound of distant footsteps grew louder, and a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a tall man in a conductor's uniform, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. "Waiting for the next train?" he asked, his voice low and hollow. "Yes," I said, trying to hide my unease. "It's not coming," he said, tilting his head slightly. "But you're welcome to wait." Eventually, the sound of a train whistle echoed through the air, and a sleek black locomotive pulled into the station. The train doors slid open, revealing empty carriages lit with dim, flickering lights. "Where does it go?" I asked the conductor. "Wherever it needs to," he replied cryptically. Something about the train felt wrong, like stepping onto it would mean stepping out of time itself. I decided to stay on the platform, and the train departed silently into the night. As the hours dragged on, I noticed something unsettling. No matter how far I walked, the platform never seemed to end. The station stretched endlessly, the same bench, the same flickering light, repeating over and over. Even the posters on the walls mirrored each other, their messages growing more sinister. "You've been here before. The tracks only lead back." I wasn't alone for long. As I turned a corner, I saw other people waiting on the platform. Silent, motionless figures staring into the darkness. They didn't acknowledge me, but their faces were pale, their eyes empty, as if they'd been drained of life. When I tried to speak to one of them, they whispered, "Don't get on the train. It's worse than staying." The clock on the wall, which had been frozen at 11:58, suddenly began to tick backward. The air grew colder, and the distant sound of a train whistle echoed again. This time, the train that arrived was different. It was older, its carriages rusted and covered in grime. The conductor appeared beside me, his face now partially visible. His eyes were hollow, glowing faintly in the dim light. "Your ride's here," he said, gesturing to the train. Against my better judgment, I stepped onto the train, desperate to leave the station. The moment the doors closed, the world outside dissolved into darkness. The windows showed nothing but a swirling void, and the interior of the train seemed to stretch endlessly, the rows of empty seats multiplying as I walked. At one point, I heard faint voices whispering my name, and when I turned around, I saw shadowy figures sitting in the seats, their faces obscured. The train came to a sudden stop and the doors slid open. I stepped out, expecting to be somewhere new, but I was back at Blackmore Station. The clock was still frozen at 11:58, and the conductor was waiting on the platform, his grin wider than before. "No one leaves," he said, tipping his hat. "Not really." Desperate to escape, I ran through the station, searching for an exit. The walls seemed to close in, the corridors looping endlessly. Eventually, I found myself back on the platform, where the same train was waiting, its doors open. This time, the posters on the walls all displayed the same message: "You can't leave until you understand." I don't remember how I got out, but I woke up in my car parked near an empty field. There was no sign of Blackmore Station, no tracks, no trains, just an eerie silence. But something was wrong. My watch was frozen at 11:58, and every now and then I hear the faint sound of a train whistle growing louder. They say schools are places of learning, but what happens when the lessons are taught by the dead? For one group of thrill seekers, entering an abandoned school at night became a terrifying crash course in survival. My name is Claire, and this happened during my senior year of college. It was the week before Halloween, and my friends and I decided to check out Hawthorne High, an old school that had been abandoned for decades. The story went that in 1978, a fire broke out during a school assembly, trapping dozens of students and teachers inside. Since then, locals claimed they could still hear the screams of the children at night, and some even said the school bell rang on its own. We thought it was just a creepy story meant to scare kids. We were wrong. The school loomed in the distance, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. The front doors were boarded up, but we found an open window and climbed inside. The air was thick with the smell of ash and mildew, and the hallways were eerily silent. "This place gives me the creeps," Jenny said, shining her flashlight down the corridor. "Relax," Brandon replied. "It's just an old building." But the deeper we went, the colder it got, and the sound of faint whispers began to echo through the halls. As we explored, we found the old gymnasium, its bleachers covered in dust. A faded banner reading Class of 1978 hung above the stage, swaying gently even though there was no breeze. On the chalkboard, someone had written, "Get out before class starts." "It's probably just some kids messing around," Brandon said, though he looked uneasy. Suddenly, the faint sound of a school bell echoed through the building, and the whispers grew louder. We decided to head upstairs, where the lockers lined the walls. As we passed, the locker doors began to rattle, one by one, until the entire hallway was filled with the deafening sound of banging metal. "Let's get out of here," Jenny said, her voice trembling. But when we turned around, the hallway behind us was gone, replaced by a solid wall. We found an open classroom and stepped inside, hoping to catch our breath. The desks were still arranged in neat rows, but each one had a name scratched into the wood. When I looked closer, I realized the names matched those of the students who had died in the fire. The temperature dropped, and the shadows in the room began to shift, taking on human shapes. "They're watching us," Jenny whispered, clutching my arm. Suddenly, Brandon screamed and pointed at the corner of the room, where a dark figure stood, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. Before we could react, the figure lunged at him, and he vanished, his scream echoing through the building. The words "one down, two to go" appeared on the chalkboard, written in a childlike scrawl. Desperate to find a way out, we stumbled upon the principal's office. Inside, we found old files scattered across the desk, detailing the events of the fire. One document caught my eye. It was a list of students marked absent, present forever. At the bottom of the list was a note. "The bell rings for those who stay too long." The sound of the bell grew louder, drawing us toward the staircase leading to the bell tower. When we reached the top, we found Brandon standing in the center of the room, his face pale and his eyes empty. "Brandon?" Jenny called, stepping closer. He turned to us, but it wasn't him anymore. His movements were jerky, and his voice was distorted. "They won't let us leave," he said, his mouth forming a twisted grin. The bell began to toll, and the shadows in the room grew darker, their forms flickering like static. "You failed the test," one of them hissed, its voice low and menacing. Jenny and I ran, but the stairs behind us seemed to stretch endlessly, looping back to the bell tower. The shadows closed in, whispering words I couldn't understand. Just as I felt the shadows pulling me in, Jenny grabbed my hand and screamed, "Close your eyes." We shut our eyes and ran blindly, the whispers fading as we burst through the front doors and into the cold night air. When we turned back, the school was gone, replaced by an overgrown field. Brandon was never found, and no one believed our story about Hawthorne High. Sometimes, I still hear the faint sound of the school bell ringing in the distance, and I know the shadows are waiting for me to come back. If you ever hear about an abandoned school with a tragic past, stay far away. Some lessons are meant to be forgotten, and some schools never stop teaching. They say forests are alive, but what happens when the forest doesn't just watch you, but traps you? For one group of campers, venturing into Shadow Pine Forest became a descent into madness and terror. My name is Matt, and this happened 2 summers ago. My friends and I had planned a camping trip to Shadow Pine Forest, a sprawling woodland known for its dense trees and secluded trails. We'd heard the stories, how people went missing, how strange sounds echoed at night, but we brushed them off as urban legends. "It's just a forest," my friend Sarah said. "People love to make up scary stories." How wrong we were. We set up camp near a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines. The first day was uneventful. We hiked, cooked over a fire, and laughed about the supposed cursed forest. But as night fell, the atmosphere changed. The forest grew unnaturally quiet. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just an eerie, oppressive silence. "It's too quiet," Sarah whispered, glancing around nervously. That night, as we lay in our tents, I was jolted awake by a faint whisper. It sounded like my name, carried on the wind. "Matt," it called, soft and distorted. I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the cold night air. The trees seemed taller, their branches twisting unnaturally, and shadows danced at the edge of the firelight. "Who's there?" I called, but the only response was a faint chuckle that sent chills down my spine. The next morning, we decided to hike to a nearby stream. But as we followed the trail, it seemed to shift and change, leading us in circles. "We've been here before," Sarah said, pointing to a tree marked with a scratch. It was the same tree we'd passed an hour ago. "We must have missed a turn," Jake said, but his voice lacked confidence. The forest felt alive, watching us, herding us deeper into its grasp. As we tried to find our way back to camp, we stumbled upon something chilling. A pile of rocks arranged in a circle with a single red handprint smeared on one of them. "What is this?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, a distant scream echoed through the forest, sharp and gut-wrenching. We froze, our hearts pounding. It sounded like me, Sarah said, her face pale. When we finally found our way back to the clearing, our camp was gone. The tents, the fire pit, our gear. Everything had vanished, as if it had never been there. "This isn't possible," Jake said, his voice shaking. The forest around us seemed darker, the trees pressing closer together. And then we saw it. A figure standing among the shadows, too far away to make out clearly. It didn't move, but we could feel its eyes on us. As night fell, the forest came alive with whispers and movement. Shadows darted between the trees, too fast to be animals. At one point, I turned and saw a figure standing just behind Sarah. It looked like her, but its eyes were black and its smile was too wide. When I blinked, it was gone, but Sarah's face was pale, her breath shallow. "I saw it too," she whispered. Jake vanished that night. We woke up to find his sleeping bag empty, his boots still by the fire. We searched the forest, calling his name, but the only response was the wind. As we stood in the clearing, we saw something hanging from a tree. A piece of Jake's shirt, torn and stained with blood. Desperate to escape, Sarah and I followed what we thought was the main trail. But no matter which way we went, we always ended up back in the same clearing. "It's playing with us," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "It doesn't want us to leave." The whispers grew louder, overlapping and echoing, as if the forest itself was speaking. That night, we found a crude altar made of twisted branches and bones. On the altar was a small wooden carving of two figures, one male, one female. "I think it's us," Sarah said, picking up the carving. The moment she touched it, the whispers stopped, and the forest fell silent. Then a low, guttural voice spoke from the darkness. "One stays, one leaves." Before I could stop her, Sarah stepped onto the altar. "I'll stay," she said, tears streaming down her face. "No," I shouted. but the shadows closed in around her, pulling her into the darkness. Her last words echoed through the forest. "Run." The path to the forest's edge suddenly appeared, and I ran without looking back, the whispers chasing me until I stumbled out into the open. I reported what happened, but no one believed me. Search teams found no trace of Sarah, Jake, or our campsite. I know the forest took them, just as it had taken so many others before. Sometimes, late at night, I hear Sarah's voice whispering my name, and I see shadows flickering at the edge of my vision. I know Shadow Pine Forest isn't done with me yet. If you ever hear about a cursed forest, don't go looking for adventure. Some places aren't just alive, they're hungry. They say some homes are full of memories. But what happens when the house remembers more than it should? For one group of explorers, stepping into an abandoned mansion became a fight for their very souls. My name is Ryan, and this story happened 4 years ago. My friends and I were always up for an adventure, especially urban exploring. We'd broken into countless abandoned places, hospitals, schools, factories, but nothing compared to the mansion on Ravenwood Hill. It had been abandoned for decades, its history shrouded in rumors. Locals claimed the family who lived there had disappeared overnight, leaving the house exactly as it was. The mansion was massive, with towering windows, ivy-covered walls, and a wrought iron gate that groaned as we pushed it open. It was supposed to be just another thrill. We didn't know it would be our last. The front door creaked open easily, as if it had been waiting for us. Inside, the air was cold and stale, carrying the faint scent of decay. The grand staircase loomed before us, its banister carved with intricate designs of vines and faces that seemed almost alive. Dust covered everything, furniture, chandeliers, even the floor, but there were no signs of rodents or decay. It was as if time had stopped the moment the family vanished. As we explored, we found a dining room with a long wooden table set for dinner. Plates, glasses, and silverware were perfectly arranged, but the food had rotted long ago, leaving behind blackened, moldy remains. "Creepy," my friend Nate said, snapping a photo, but something felt off. The shadows in the room seemed deeper, stretching unnaturally toward us. Then we heard it. The faint sound of footsteps upstairs. We froze, exchanging nervous glances. "Probably just an animal," Sarah said, trying to sound brave. But deep down, we all knew better. As we climbed the staircase, the air grew colder. At the top was a long hallway lined with portraits of the family who had once lived there. Their faces were stern and lifelike, their eyes seeming to follow us as we walked past. One painting, in particular, caught my attention. A woman in a dark gown holding a small child. Her expression was solemn, but her eyes were filled with sadness. As I stared, I could have sworn her lips moved. At the end of the hallway, we found a door that wasn't on the blueprints we'd found online. The handle was cold to the touch, and when we opened it, we stepped into a room that didn't make sense. It was circular, with walls covered in strange symbols and mirrors that reflected only darkness. In the center of the room was a small table with a single, flickering candle and an old book bound in leather. The book's title was scrawled in faded ink, The Binding of Souls. Curiosity got the better of us, and Nate opened the book. The pages were filled with strange, looping script that none of us could read. "What is this?" Sarah asked, leaning over his shoulder. As Nate flipped through the pages, the candle went out, plunging the room into darkness. When we lit our flashlights, the symbols on the walls were glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Suddenly, the air grew heavier, and the whispers began. They were soft at first, like distant voices, but soon they grew louder, overlapping and echoing through the room. "You shouldn't be here," a voice hissed, low and guttural. The shadows on the walls began to stretch and move, forming into figures with hollow eyes and twisted faces. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice trembling, but when we turned to the door, it was gone, replaced by a solid wall. Panicking, we ran back into the hallway, but it wasn't the same. The portraits were gone, and the walls stretched endlessly in both directions. The floor creaked beneath our feet, and the shadows followed us, their whispers growing louder. "No matter where we go, we're still in the house," Nate said, his voice shaking. As we turned a corner, we saw her, the woman from the portrait. She stood at the end of the hallway, her dark gown billowing as if caught in an invisible breeze. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice echoing unnaturally. "We didn't mean to disturb you," Sarah said, stepping forward. The woman's expression darkened. "You opened the book. Now you're part of the house." Desperate to escape, we ran back to the staircase, but the front door was gone, replaced by a massive mirror. In the reflection, we saw ourselves standing in the dining room, the shadows closing in around us. "They're trapping us," Nate said, his voice breaking. The woman appeared behind us, her hollow eyes glowing. "No one leaves Ravenwood," she whispered. Thinking fast, I grabbed the book from Nate and threw it into the fireplace. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into smoke as the symbols on the walls faded. The air grew lighter, and the front door reappeared. We bolted outside, the mansion's windows glowing faintly as we ran into the night. We never spoke about what happened, and none of us ever returned to Ravenwood Hill. A year later, I read an article about the mansion. It claimed no one had lived there for over a century, and everyone who entered either disappeared or went mad. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear whispers and see faint shadows moving in the corner of my eye. I wonder if a part of me is still trapped in that house. If you ever come across an abandoned mansion that feels too quiet, trust your instincts. Some houses aren't just haunted, they're alive, and they're always hungry for more.